The sun rose over a quiet suburban street, casting golden light across neatly trimmed lawns and tree-lined sidewalks. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed, and the faint hum of a lawnmower echoed in the distance. In the front yard of one of the houses, Michael Thompson, a black man in his 40s, knelt beside a flower bed. Gloves on his hands, wide-brimmed hat shielding his face, he carefully pruned rose bushes and watered freshly planted shrubs. The scent of damp soil and blooming flowers hung in the air. Inside the house across the street, Mrs. Parker, a white woman in her 60s, peeked through her blinds. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Michael work. She muttered under her breath, her voice sharp with suspicion, "Who does he think he is, digging around over there? He doesn't belong here." Her husband glanced over from the kitchen table. "Maybe he's just gardening," he said cautiously. Mrs. Parker waved him off. No. There's something off about him. I don't trust him." Minutes passed, but she continued to watch, her suspicion growing with each careful movement Michael made. To her, it wasn't just gardening, it was plotting. Michael, unaware of the eyes tracking him, moved with quiet precision, trimming leaves and straightening the mulch. He hummed softly to himself, focused on his work, completely at peace. Across the street, Mrs. Parker picked up her phone and began to dial. "I'm calling the police," she muttered. "Something's not right here. He's up to no good." And in that quiet suburban morning, an ordinary act of tending to a garden was about to set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Mrs. Parker's fingers trembled slightly as she held the phone to her ear. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report a suspicious person," she began, her voice tight with concern. "There's a man in my neighborhood. He's digging and moving around. I think he might be trespassing. Please, you need to come quickly." The dispatcher asked for details, and she rattled off Michael's location, describing his dark clothing and the way he moved in the yard. Her voice grew urgent, fueled by fear and suspicion rather than fact. Meanwhile, Michael continued his work, completely unaware of the call. He pruned the roses carefully, his hands steady and methodical. The sun climbed higher, casting shadows across the yard. Birds flitted from tree to tree, oblivious to the tension building across the street. By the time Mrs. Parker hung up, she felt a sense of righteousness. She had done her civic duty, protecting the neighborhood, at least in her mind. A few minutes later, the distant hum of a police siren grew louder. Michael looked up from the flower bed, confused, as a patrol car rolled down the street, lights flashing softly. From inside the house, Mrs. Parker peeked out the window again, gripping the curtain. Finally, she whispered, her heart pounding. "They'll see what's going on. They'll know I was right." She had no idea that her suspicion was about to collide with a truth far larger than she could imagine. The distant hum of sirens grew louder, echoing off the neatly trimmed hedges of the suburban street. Michael straightened for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow, puzzled by the flashing lights approaching. Moments later, 2 patrol cars pulled up, tires crunching softly on the asphalt. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, their hands resting lightly on their belts. Michael raised a hand in greeting, calm and composed. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you?" The first officer, a young man with a stern expression, approached cautiously. "Sir, we received a call reporting suspicious activity. Can you explain what you're doing here?" Michael gestured to the garden around him. "I'm tending to my property," he said evenly. "These are my flower beds. I live here. I own this house." The second officer glanced over the neatly pruned bushes, the freshly mulched soil, the roses arranged in precise rows. "It looks like you're just gardening," he said. Before Michael could say more, Mrs. Parker stormed onto her front lawn, pointing furiously in his direction. "No. He's lying. He's trespassing. He doesn't live here." Michael set down his gardening gloves, standing tall but non-confrontational. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice calm but firm, "this is my home. I have the deeds, the documents, everything's in order. You're welcome to check with the county records." The officers exchanged glances. One began walking toward Michael's side, the other cautiously eyeing Mrs. Parker. "Do you have identification or property papers with you?" the first officer asked. Michael nodded, reaching into his jacket pocket. He handed over a folder with official documents, carefully organized, showing the property deeds and proof of ownership for the house, and several adjacent properties. Mrs. Parker's mouth opened, but no words came out. The officer scanned the documents, flipping through page after page. The first officer looked at her. "Ma'am. It appears he owns this house," he said slowly, trying to keep his tone neutral. Mrs. Parker's face paled. She backed away, her hands shaking slightly. That's impossible," she stammered. He can't own this street." Michael stepped closer, his expression calm and composed. "I don't just own this street," he said evenly. "I own the properties on both sides of the block. I've invested in this community, maintaining the gardens and houses. I'm a homeowner and a neighbor." The officers nodded to each other. One turned back to Mrs. Parker, gently but firmly. "Ma'am, it looks like you've made a mistake. This man is the property owner. There's no crime here." She swallowed, her eyes wide with shock, and stepped back toward her porch, unable to speak. Michael returned to his gardening, picking up the shears and resuming his work as if nothing had happened. The sunlight reflected off the leaves and flowers, peaceful and serene, contrasting sharply with the chaos that had just unfolded. The officers gave a polite nod and returned to their vehicles, the sirens fading as they drove away. Mrs. Parker remained on her porch, frozen, staring at Michael tending to his property with a calm dignity she had never expected to see. For the first time, she realized the truth: all her suspicion and fear had been misplaced. And she had been judging a man based on nothing more than the color of his skin. Michael, unaware of the magnitude of the lesson being absorbed across the street, hummed softly and continued trimming the roses, the blocks of his ownership stretching silently behind him, a quiet empire built with care and diligence, invisible to those who had assumed he didn't belong. Mrs. Parker remained frozen on her porch, her fingers gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced, replaying the scene over and over: the police sirens, the flashing lights, Michael calmly producing property deeds, and the officer's stunned expressions. Each memory felt like a punch to her pride. Unable to contain herself any longer, she stepped off the porch and stomped toward Michael's yard. Her voice trembled as she shouted, "This isn't possible. You can't own all these houses. You can't just. This is our neighborhood." Michael stood, gloves still in hand, calm and composed. He looked at her, his tone measured and kind, but carrying a quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I've owned this block for years. I maintain the houses, the gardens, the streets. This is my investment, my home. You are welcome here as a neighbor, but your assumptions about me are incorrect." Mrs. Parker's jaw dropped. She stared at him in disbelief. "No. That's impossible. You're just a gardener. You can't." Michael gestured to the neatly pruned bushes, the immaculate flower beds, and the row of homes stretching down the street. "Please," he said softly, instead of assuming, "take a moment to see the facts. I care for this neighborhood, and I've done it with respect and diligence." By now, a few curious neighbors had gathered, drawn by the commotion. They whispered among themselves, pointing at Michael and glancing at Mrs. Parker. "Wait, he owns these houses? Every single one on this block?" Mrs. Parker's face burned crimson. She looked at the crowd and realized every whispered comment, every sideways glance, was a judgment, but this time, it was hers being judged. The officers who had returned briefly to clarify paperwork now nodded toward Michael, signaling that everything was legitimate. "It's true," one said quietly. "He owns the entire block." Mrs. Parker stumbled back, her mouth dry. She opened it to speak, but no words came. Michael continued his work, picking up a watering can and moving down the flower beds as if nothing had happened. His calm, confident demeanor only amplified her embarrassment. Neighbors began to murmur appreciatively, recognizing the care and dedication he had put into the block over the years. The realization sank in: the quiet man they had assumed was just a gardener was in fact the steward of their neighborhood, the one maintaining every lawn and flower bed with care. Mrs. Parker's voice finally came out as a whisper, almost to herself. I can't believe I assumed the worst." Michael paused, setting down the watering can. He gave her a small, forgiving nod. "There's nothing to be ashamed of in learning the truth," he said. "But next time, try seeing the person, not the assumptions." The crowd around them clapped softly, some chuckling at the irony, others nodding in respect. Mrs. Parker's shoulders slumped, a deep blush spreading across her face. The lesson was clear. The quiet, diligent man she had feared and judged based on nothing more than his skin color was the very person whose hard work and integrity had shaped the street she called home. And in that moment, she understood something she would never forget. By late morning, word of the confrontation had spread. Neighbors peeked from their windows, children stopped playing in the street, and a few people stepped outside to see what had caused the commotion. Whispers began to ripple through the block like wildfire. "Did you see? He owns the whole street. Every house? Seriously? I always thought he was just the quiet guy who kept to himself." Across the block, neighbors approached Michael cautiously, some curious, some awestruck. They expected a simple gardener, someone renting a house perhaps, maybe a nice man who tended his yard. Instead, they found a calm, confident man standing among pristine flower beds, holding a watering can like a tool of pride and mastery over his domain. A couple who lived 2 doors down approached. "Michael, you own this entire block?" the man asked, eyes wide. Michael nodded, smiling warmly. "Yes. I've invested in these homes over the years, maintaining them and renting them responsibly. This neighborhood is important to me. I wanted it to be a place people could be proud of." The neighbors exchanged astonished glances. Some whispered apologies to each other, realizing how easily assumptions had guided their thoughts. They had judged him silently, seeing him as just a gardener, not realizing the magnitude of his presence and influence. Even Mrs. Parker, standing a few steps behind, couldn't look away. Her face burned crimson, shame and disbelief battling for dominance in her expression. Every neighbor she had whispered with now glanced at her knowingly. She had accused and assumed, and now the entire block knew the truth. Michael continued working quietly, pruning a rose bush with precision, seemingly unfazed by the attention. Yet the people around him were buzzing with newfound respect and admiration. Children pointed at him, whispering to their parents. Adults nodded, murmuring about stewardship and dedication, and the way he had quietly shaped the neighborhood into something beautiful. Mrs. Parker swallowed hard, realizing that the quiet man she had feared and judged was in fact the foundation of the very community she called home. Her assumptions had been both wrong and small, and she felt the full weight of her misjudgment. For the first time, the neighborhood didn't just see Michael, they truly noticed him. Later that afternoon, the neighborhood had settled, but Mrs. Parker remained on her porch, staring at Michael as he carefully tended the flower beds. His movements were deliberate, graceful, and full of care, every cut of a branch, every placement of mulch, a testament to years of dedication. Her hands gripped the railing tightly. She replayed the morning over and over, the phone call, the police arriving, the moment she demanded action against him. She could feel the heat of embarrassment rising again. How could she have been so quick to judge? She thought she was protecting the neighborhood, but in reality, she had assumed the worst, purely based on the color of his skin. Every step of her prejudice now weighed heavily on her conscience. Her neighbors had seen everything. Whispers of awe and surprise had filled the street, and she realized that everyone around her had learned a lesson she hadn't expected to teach herself. She had publicly assumed wrong, and now she had to live with the consequences. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the lump of shame and guilt. Quietly, she muttered to herself, I treated him like a stranger, like a threat. When he's the one who's cared for all of us." Michael, noticing her across the yard, paused and looked up. He didn't scold her or make her feel small. Instead, he gave a gentle nod, not of superiority, but of quiet understanding. His calm composure and years of dedication spoke louder than any words ever could. Mrs. Parker realized something profound. Her assumptions had blinded her, but the truth had been patiently waiting, visible to anyone willing to see it. She had been taught a lesson in humility, dignity, and the quiet power of someone's integrity. She exhaled slowly, letting her shoulders drop. There was no applause for her shame, only the silent acknowledgement that she had been wrong. But even that was a start. For the first time, she truly saw Michael, not as a threat, but as the man who had quietly shaped an entire street with his hands and heart. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the houses, Michael continued his work in the garden, the rows of roses and trimmed hedges shining in the light. The neighborhood had gathered quietly along the sidewalk, whispering in awe and admiration. Neighbors who had once only seen him as the gardener now recognized him as the steward of the entire block. Mrs. Parker remained on her porch, her face flushed with embarrassment, but also softened with newfound respect. She watched as children waved at Michael, neighbors approached him to ask gardening tips, and even a few waved an apology for their earlier assumptions. Michael paused, wiping his hands on his gloves, and looked up. He gave a small, forgiving smile toward Mrs. Parker. "There's nothing wrong with learning," he said gently. "But assumptions can blind us. Sometimes, it's worth taking the time to see the person first." She nodded, barely able to speak. Words felt inadequate. Instead, she simply bowed her head in acknowledgement, understanding the weight of her prejudice and the quiet dignity with which he had carried himself. Across the street, children ran along the sidewalks, laughing, while neighbors tended their own lawns with newfound care. The block looked alive, maintained, and respected, a reflection of the man who had been quietly shaping it for years. Michael returned to the flower beds, humming softly, calm and focused. The lesson had been delivered, not with anger or confrontation, but with patience, perseverance, and quiet authority. Mrs. Parker exhaled, feeling the full measure of the morning's events. She had been humbled, and in that humility, she finally understood what it meant to truly see someone. As the sun set over the neighborhood, the camera pulled back, capturing the entire block in golden light, pristine gardens, flourishing homes, and Michael at the center, tending his street with the quiet pride of a man whose work, integrity, and patience had reshaped not only the gardens but the hearts of those around him. Sometimes, the greatest power is quiet. And the greatest lessons come in humility.